In today's short video, we're going to be looking at the world of decals. What if there was a different way of doing things? So let's explore that possibility. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. Decals can be one of the most challenging things to get right on a scale model. And because of that, a standard, a way of doing things has evolved over time to guarantee us results. If you ask the average scale modeler how they apply their decals, usually it goes something a bit like this. Over your paint layers, you need to apply a layer of gloss varnish. Next up, you apply a setting solution. Next up, you soak your decal in water to release it from the backing paper. It's slid in place, the air bubbles are removed, the decal is left to dry, and once dry, a softening solution is applied. Once this has dried and the decal has settled into the details, you can then finish it with a satin, matte, or a gloss varnish. What if I told you that you don't necessarily have to decal over a gloss varnish? Now you may say, what about silvering? But I bet a good few of you have had silvering occur, even when the decal has been placed onto a gloss surface. This quote from a Fine Scale forum post outlines the general consensus as to why silvering happens. The quote states, "When you decal over an uneven surface, the decal only adheres to the peaks and it can't conform to the valleys. This lets air under the decal and makes bubbles. That is what silvering really is, bubbles. This is why Future is so popular with modelers." End quote. Future is in reference to the strangely popular floor varnish used by some modelers. And while smoothness is important when applying decals, this doesn't have to be a smooth gloss finish. You can still have smooth matte paint. But one thing I don't see discussed very often, and I think this is key, is adhesion. For the last few years, I've pretty much skipped the gloss process on 99% of my builds, and I honestly believe that good decal practices, on top of a smooth paint, be that a matte or a slight satin, can eliminate 99% of silvering issues. And making sure the decal is adhered to that paint correctly is key. And by using a good setting solution and not over soaking your decals in water, you can do the same, and potentially eliminate one of the steps that's most likely to cause mess ups, that pesky gloss varnish. In a second, I'm going to show you my process, but before that, let's quickly go over smooth paint, one of the most important steps, and how we can try and make our paint smooth every time. There are 3 points that I think are key to getting smooth paint: thinning, proximity, and application. Thinning, of course, is key to any airbrush spraying. Make sure your paint is nice and thin. When using lacquers or alcohol-based acrylics like Tamiya, Mr. Leveling Thinner is a great thinner to make sure your paint goes down smoothly. For acrylics, pure true acrylics like Vallejo, a thinner that slightly slows drying is probably going to help a lot. Proximity, or the distance from which you're spraying, is also really important. The further away you are from the model when you're spraying, the more chance you have of paint particles drying before it hits the surface, creating a surface that is more coarse, and I think that's undesirable in all aspects of scale modelling. And finally, application. Light, wet, overlapping layers is the way forward. Keep your paint coats thin and overlap each line of spray with the last. And finally, before we get started, a quick note on paint reactivity. There are so many different brands of paint and setting solutions out there, all made with different formulations and ingredients. Some of these are completely inert and won't damage your paint finish, but I do recommend you test this before committing this to an actual model, because you may find your paint and setting solutions aren't best of friends. So there are a few things we're going to need for today's demo. In no particular order, some setting solution. I have 2 types on my workbench: Microsol, Microset, and my favourite VMS Decal Set and Fix and Decal Softener. I have 2 different types because not all decals are created equally, and different brands can react differently to different setting solutions. A 10A scalpel and a steel rule for cutting decals out from their sheet, a brush for applying setting solution, and cotton buds to make sure the decal is pressed down firmly to the surface, some warm water straight out of the hot tap. It's important to keep your decal warm, so keep refreshing this throughout your session. Your finishing varnish of choice. I really rate these VMS ones. Of course, some decals. I'm using the ones that came with the kit. These are the new style peelable Edward decals, but we won't be peeling them this time. And finally, a paper towel. And of course, a sacrifice. This is the Edward 190 that I used in my gallery airbrush review video. Right, let's cut some decals out and get to work. These Edward decals do look patchy, but that's just the film, so they might look a bit rubbish until the final varnish is on. As we said before, adhesion is key, so when I dip my decal into my decal water, it's not for very long. The decal's placed in for about 5 seconds and then removed. If you leave it in there for too long, you'll start to lose some of the decal adhesive that's on the paper. The decal is then placed onto the paper towel to wick away the excess water and to leave it to soak whilst I apply my first setting solution. This time I'm using VMS Decal Set and Fix. This works as an extra layer of adhesive and helps the decal to stick to the painted surface better. The Decal Set and Fix is brushed onto the area where I'm going to apply the decal. This will bead up a little, but when the decal's pressed over it, it will spread out and fill all the gaps. Now the decal's been soaking for a while, it's had time to release from the backing paper. And because it wasn't soaked for too long, there's still loads of that lovely adhesive on there. As per normal, the decal is slid away from the backing paper onto the surface of the model. I'm going to mention once again the Edward decal film. It looks patchy and it looks like the decal is already silvering, but this is just the film and will disappear later. Once the decal's in place, it's time to start pressing it down onto the surface. You don't want to go too crazy here because you can push the adhesive out from underneath the decal, leading to silvering. I use a cotton bud with some pressure and roll this over the surface of the decal. When using cotton buds, you need to be careful of leftover lint. This is why I slightly dampen mine before using them. Once my rolling is complete, the decal is left to dry. And once the decal is dry, either an hour later or overnight, it's time to apply some softening solution. This helps the decal conform into surface details like panel lines and rivets. It can also help with complex curved areas. Another method to help stubborn decals settle down is a gentle application of heat. The softening solution, this time I'm using VMS Decal Softener, is brushed over the decal in its entirety. It's best to only paint this onto the decal film in thin controlled layers. Adding too much and letting the decal solution pool up over areas of paint can cause the setting solution to react with your paint. And this does also apply to clear coats as well. So, as with most things in modelling, precision and care is key. You can help speed this process along with gentle pressure applied with a cotton bud. But please be careful here. Too much pressure over too much setting solution can damage the decal. This may take several passes and several applications to get the decal to settle into the detail. It's the next day and I've put a handful of decals on my Edward FW190. The decals seem to have set reasonably well into the details. All that's left to do now is to finish them off with a matte varnish. As a quick note, these decals were applied straight onto MRP paint with no gloss in between them. So let's spray some varnish. I gave my airbrush a quick blast onto the paper towel to make sure the varnish was spraying smoothly and clean from any contaminants. This was then lightly misted over the decal. Notice that patchy looking Edward decal film is losing its patchiness. Usually these German wing crosses can be quite tricky because they're 99%, well that's an exaggeration, they are mostly carrier film apart from the white sections of the cross. I'm noticing here that my decal didn't fully conform to the surface details, but that's on my setting process. The rivets on these Edward aircraft are notoriously difficult to get right, but that's not the point of the exercise. The matte varnish was sprayed firstly over all of the decals and then over the entire right hand side of the aircraft. As a side note, I'm pleasantly surprised with the thickness of these new in-house Edward decals. I was very prepared to have to do some sanding to get rid of any raised edges of carrier film, but because these decals are so thin, I don't think I'm going to have to. Anyway, this varnish concludes my video on applying decals onto a surface that hasn't been prepared with gloss varnish. This topic is pretty controversial, and there have been very vocal arguments on both sides of the fence as to what is better. Me, personally, I try and avoid gloss varnish. I've had several instances in the past where for one reason or another my gloss layer has failed, and I like to think, you may disagree, that I'm fairly handy with an airbrush, so I think my problems were with the varnish and not how it was applied. And in no way am I saying that you must do it this way. This process of eliminating the gloss works well for me and several others in the hobby. But there are so many different ways of doing things in this hobby, and everyone's got their own preference. What I am going to ask though, is if you haven't tried it, give it a go. You may be pleasantly surprised, and if not, you've tried something new, and that's never a bad thing. And whatever you do, let me know in the comments how you get on. Best of luck and happy modelling. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreons for supporting my work. Your support is much appreciated. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. I'll see you in the next one.